Soils are teeming with life, and it's been said that soil is the most complex and diverse ecosystem on Earth. 1 teaspoon of soil may contain as many organisms as there are humans on this planet. It may contain hundreds of meters of fungal hyphae, protozoa, nematodes, insect mites, and other animals. And if you add them all up, you may find that 1 acre of soil contains 37 tons of organisms. That is equal to the mass of 50 cows. Now granted, most of these are teeny tiny, but they play important roles in soils. Most of these organisms are involved in the decomposition of organic matter, which is a really important mechanism that stores and releases nutrients and keeps nutrients cycling through ecosystems. They help fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. Others are ecosystem engineers. Earthworms are a prime example for that. They may cause plant diseases, or they may help in suppressing pathogens. But all of them together work in this wonderful system, the soil ecosystem. The sum total of life on Earth, together with the global environment, constitutes the ecosphere. And then the ecosphere, in turn, is composed of numerous self-sustaining communities of organisms and their inorganic environments and resources, which we call an ecosystem. An ecosystem contains organisms, minerals, nutrients, water, energy, air, and other abiotic constituents to form unique combinations that make up unique ecosystems. And within the Soil 205 class, when we talk about ecosystems, we spend a lot of time talking about the abiotic environment, and now we want to talk a little more about the biotic environment. The organisms contained within these ecosystems can be grouped numerous ways. One of them is to simply group them by size, where we distinguish micro, meso, and macrofauna. We can distinguish them, or we can separate them into classes based on phylogeny, or we can look where they obtain their carbon and energy. And we've already learned about some of these terms. We've learned about photoautotrophs. These get their carbon from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, and they get their energy from the sun. In contrast to that, there's also chemoautotrophs. Now, they're also called autotrophs because they get their carbon from the same source, from atmospheric carbon dioxide, but they're called chemoautotrophs because they get their energy not from the sun, but they get it by oxidation of inorganics. So most nitrifying bacteria will be chemoautotrophs. But there's actually a much larger group of organisms in soil that we call chemoheterotrophs. Now these get their energy and their carbon from organic carbon. That makes them consumers in the system because they eat organic carbon that was assembled by the producers in the system. The major primary producers are the plants that use solar energy and carbon from the atmosphere in photosynthesis. The tops of plants then provide food for consumers and decomposers above the soil, and roots, tubers, and other underground organs provide food for consumers and decomposers within the soil itself. There's an additional small amount of inorganic carbon that gets fixed by the chemotrophic bacteria, and when we take this all together, the productivity of a terrestrial ecosystem is basically a measure of the net photosynthesis, which is the photosynthesis minus the respiration by the plants. In the transformation of plant material into animal biomass, considerable carbon is returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and some energy is dissipated as heat. And most of the original carbon, most of the nutrients are still in the feces, which is why manure is such a good source of nutrients. The primary consumers eventually become food for secondary consumers and tertiary and so forth, additional levels of consumers. Eventually, they all die, they're added to the soil along with all the fecal material and whatever is left from the primary production that was unused. These materials then serve as food for all the soil-dwelling consumers and decomposers, and ultimately all the carbon that was originally fixed in photosynthesis is returned back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and the energy is lost as heat. The nutrients that were originally absorbed by the producers are released for use in another cycle of growth and decay, and the result is that the major function of soil organisms, although that sounds kind of sad to say, is in the cycling of energy and nutrients, where the producers immobilize and assimilate nutrients, and then all the other participants mineralize and help in the release of nutrients. The majority of consumers in soils are microorganisms, and most of their job is the decomposition of organic materials. At the sort of soil and root interface, the plant and the microorganisms have a whole bunch in common. Both of them absorb the soluble nutrients from the same soil solution and use energy to accumulate these nutrients against the concentration gradient. So diffusion will play a big role in how the nutrients get to both of them. Both are affected by water availability as expressed by water potential gradients and the conductivities to replenish the water that they take up. And they're inhibited by the exact same salts, and they compete for soil oxygen the same way. So plants and microorganisms are competitors in a lot of ways, but they also depend on each other in this continuous cycling of energy and nutrients, and some of them have created symbiotic relationships. The majority of these microorganisms are bacteria, and they're not only the smallest living organism in soils, but they're also the most numerous. Most soil bacteria require oxygen from the soil and are classified as aerobes. And some aerobic bacteria can adapt to living in the presence or absence of oxygen. Then we call them facultative aerobes. But other bacteria cannot live in the presence of oxygen at all, and then they're anaerobes. Soil bacteria differ considerably in their nutrition and their response to environmental conditions. Consequently, the kinds and abundance of bacteria depend both on the available nutrients present and on the soil environmental conditions. The bacteria habitat requirements make them mesophilic or extremophiles, which means that they have really strict requirements for what their habitat looks like. It has to have just the right temperature, the right water availability, the right pH range, has to have oxygen or no oxygen available, has to have food, the nutrients, and the carbons available. In addition to that, they're quite vulnerable to drying. So most of them are not going to be very mobile, and they require biofilms or pore water to live in. And given the right conditions, they reproduce extremely fast. However, the growth is normally not sustained for very long because they either run out of one of the important things that they need, for example, a food source, or the byproducts that they create just kind of accumulate too much, and then their growth will stop. The other really important microorganisms are fungi, and these are all heterotrophs that vary tremendously in their size and structure. The individual threads that they produce after they've reproduced from spores are called hyphae, and all of the hyphae taken together, we call them mycelium. And the mycelium is the working structure that absorbs nutrients, continues to grow, and eventually produces special hyphae that produce reproductive spores like the one that you see here in the picture. Hyphae, for the most part, or fungi, live under aerobic conditions, and they have a major advantage over bacteria in that they can both grow, invade, and penetrate organic material. So they're not necessarily just bound by the individual habitat that they're in. Fungi are important in all soils, but their tolerance to more acidic soils makes them particularly important in acidic forest soils, where they're really efficient decomposers, and like we've learned earlier in the semester, they're really important for stabilizing aggregates with their hyphae. Now, like I said earlier, both the plants, the bacteria, and the fungi get all their food through diffusion. And the diffusion of ions in solution is relatively slow, as you can imagine. But the diffusion rates vary quite a bit between nitrate, ammonia, and phosphorus. And you can see that especially access to phosphorus is going to be quite limited because there the diffusion rates are really, really low. And fungi play a large role in enabling plants access to all these nutrients, and especially phosphorus, by forming a symbiotic relationship by which sugars are more or less exchanged for nutrients. And the way that the fungi do this is by basically extending the root system of the plant. The root system of a plant will normally be in the order of maybe 100 meters per square meter of soil, and fungi can greatly, exponentially expand the soil volume that is explored with the hyphae, and not just volume-wise, but bring the diffusion lengths down to where the distance that an ion has to travel to enter a fungi are much, much, much shorter than what it would be with just the plant roots alone. So fungi and bacteria in soils function as decomposers. They help break down residue. They accumulate some of this organic residue in their biomass and thereby immobilize or retain nutrients in soils. They do create new organic compounds as part of this decomposition that become sources of energy and nutrients for other organisms. They produce organic glues that help bind soil aggregates together, and in the case of fungal hyphae, also physically bind them together. Bacteria are very involved in converting different forms of nitrogens. We have nitrifying and denitrifying bacteria affecting the nitrogen cycle of soils. And bacteria and fungi also compete with disease-causing organisms by competing for that food and habitat. Some of the bacteria help directly with plant growth by fixing nitrogen, and fungi, as we've learned, form mycorrhizal associations with roots and deliver nutrients such as phosphorus and water to the plant. So in addition to the fungi and bacteria, we also have things like nematodes and arthropods in the soil. And they can function in a number of different ways. They can be pathogens or parasites in that they consume other plant parts which can weaken structures and cause disease. And nematodes in particular can be directly functioning as parasites. And in doing so, of course, they also might cause potential yield losses. So in the case of nematodes in Idaho, the potato nematodes are an area of great concern because of that. In addition to these, we also have protozoa. Well, these are mostly grazers. So in other words, they eat bacteria and fungi and thereby release plant-available nitrogen and other nutrients that they get from eating them as food. These protozoa and some nematodes as well control many root-feeding or disease-causing pests and stimulate and control the activity of bacterial populations. The nematodes and arthropods also feed on fungi, so thereby stimulate and control the activity in population as well. In addition to these, we also have a lowly earthworm, which together with some of the larger arthropods functions as shredders, meaning they help break down residue in a structure. And in shredding the plant litter, they make it available for bacteria and fungi that otherwise would have a hard time attacking larger structures. The earthworms are macroarthropods in some sense also habitat then in their own guts and in the fecal pellets that they spit out. And lastly, they do enhance soil structure quite, especially in the case of earthworms, which is why earthworms are also considered to be ecosystem engineers. And then, of course, there's also higher level predators like voles and mice and the connection to ecosystems without or outside of the soil system. So fungi and bacteria as microbes are strongly limited by the availability of carbon and nitrogen in soils, in addition to needing just the right kind of physical conditions in terms of availability of water, availability of electron acceptors such as oxygen, right kind of pH, right kind of temperature, and so forth. Well, they are also quite immobile, so they cannot seek out these perfect conditions and have to wait for these conditions to occur. When they occur, though, these microbes have an incredible metabolic ability in that they can ramp up their metabolisms very quickly and multiply relatively quickly and have incredible digestive ability. These waiting for the right conditions and not being able to go to where the right conditions are has given the sleeping beauty paradox, which was coined in soil biology, and that describes the discrepancy between potentially high metabolic capabilities with sort of the need to lie dormant and wait for the right kind of conditions, or as it's coined there, to wait for the Prince Charming. Now, the Prince Charming can be a macroorganism that helps bring food there, help improve the physical conditions for the microbes to become active, or as a dispersal mechanism to bring microorganisms to other places in the soil system. So the larger soil fauna then helps, in a sense, accelerate the decomposition of organic matter, helps mix the organic matter in the mineral soil, we call that bioturbation, and helps improve the soil properties by increasing aggregate formation and creating burrows and biopores that can be colonized by microbial actors. So the primary decomposition function is shredding and thereby helping in the formation of humus in soils. The large heterogeneity, both in space and time, in terms of the right kind of conditions and food availability for life in soils, means that life is not dispersed equally in the soil system, but can be found in hotspots. So some of these hotspots are close to the food source, like in the case of the rhizosphere, where food is, or microbial life is concentrated around the root zone. It happens within pores, within the porosphere. It is sometimes concentrated within individual aggregates, which the aggregate itself may not only contain the food, but also is a way of protecting life from predators, because you need to have a certain size to be able to enter the aggregate sphere. Life can be concentrated around the burrows of earthworms, because their casts and their linings are enriched in nutrients. And of course the detriosphere is where the original organic material from the biomass by plants is being dropped and has a zone where food is relatively available. The end result, though, is that, well, 90% of the soil is more or less not devoid of life, but at least dormant in terms of biological activity, and only about 10% of the soil sees some active biological activity, at least as long as food and the right kind of conditions are lasting.